Strange premonitions in marriage. Sarah had always believed her marriage to Daniel was built on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. For years, their routines had blended together seamlessly. The quiet breakfast conversations, the quick kisses before work, the occasional date nights when they could pull themselves away from hectic schedules. Yet lately, an invisible chill seemed to creep into the warmth of their home, subtle but impossible to ignore. It started with the little things. Daniel started coming home later than usual, claiming an endless stream of urgent meetings and after-hours work obligations. There were moments when he seemed distracted, staring off into space during dinner, answering her questions with vague nods or half-hearted smiles. His laughter, once genuine and effortless, had become forced, as though he were trying to mask an inner turmoil. Sarah tried to reason with herself. She told herself that every relationship went through rough patches, that perhaps Daniel was simply overwhelmed with work stress. Whenever doubt gnawed at her, she smothered it with reassuring thoughts. Maybe he just needed space, maybe she was being paranoid. But the signs became harder to explain away. She noticed Daniel was suddenly protective of his phone, carrying it everywhere, even into the bathroom, something he had never done before. There were hushed phone calls behind closed doors, unexplained texts from unknown numbers, and frequent changes to his daily routine. When Sarah questioned him, he would brush off her concerns, even laughing them off as overthinking. Nights grew longer and lonelier. Sarah would often lie awake, replaying every interaction in her mind and scrutinizing each shift in his behavior. In the past, Daniel had always been eager to share stories from his day, but now their conversations felt stilted, weighed down by an unspoken tension. The intimacy between them faded, replaced by an awkward distance neither dared to address. Despite the mounting suspicion, Sarah kept her worries hidden deep inside. She didn't confide in anyone, not even Emily, her closest friend and confidant. Instead, she became hypervigilant, quietly observing Daniel's every move and clinging to the hope that her fears were unfounded. She watched. She listened. She waited, her heart heavy with a dread she couldn't name. As days passed, that dread blossomed into a persistent unease. The home they shared no longer felt like a safe haven. It became a minefield of doubt and second-guessing. Yet even as she struggled to suppress her anxieties, Sarah refused to confront Daniel outright. Somewhere, she still wished for an innocent explanation, a return to the stability they once shared. But deep down, Sarah sensed that her marriage was standing on the edge of a precipice and that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. The heartbreaking revelation. The quiet tension that had taken root in Sarah's marriage finally reached its breaking point on a gray Saturday morning that seemed ordinary in every way. Daniel had left the house early, mumbling something about a last-minute meeting at the office. Sarah stood in the kitchen, cradling her coffee mug, trying to shake off the familiar ache of suspicion that refused to dissipate. It was pure accident, or perhaps fate, that guided her that day. Restless and hoping to silence her swirling thoughts, Sarah decided to clean the apartment, a task she usually reserved for Sundays. She moved from room to room, picking up forgotten socks and empty glasses, absent-mindedly wiping down countertops. When she reached the study, she noticed Daniel's tablet had been left behind on the desk, screen still glowing from recent use. Normally, she would have respected his privacy, but an inexplicable urge drew her closer. At first, she only meant to turn the device off, but as her hand brushed the tablet, a message notification flashed on the screen. Sarah's heart quickened. The name Emily appeared, her dearest friend since college, the godmother of her child, the person she trusted with her deepest secrets. Without giving herself time to reconsider, she tapped the screen. Threads of messages unfolded, playful, intimate, filled with inside jokes and endearments that went far beyond the bounds of friendship. There were plans made in whispers, rendezvous arranged in hotels, confessions of secret love and longing. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. The world seemed to tilt off its axis. She scrolled through the barrage of messages, numb yet hyper-aware of each cruel detail. The stolen glances, the shared memories bent and broken by betrayal. The realization landed with crushing clarity. Her husband and her best friend had not only crossed a line, but they had done so repeatedly, recklessly, right under her nose. Every flashback from recent months replayed in her mind with horrifying clarity. Emily's evasive responses about her own late evenings, Daniel's irritation whenever Emily's name was mentioned, the awkward silences that would fall whenever the three of them were together. Each hesitation and tight smile suddenly made sense, a bleak mosaic she had been too blind to assemble until now. Sarah stood frozen for long minutes, unable to reconcile the gravity of what she was reading with the two people she had loved and trusted most in the world. Grief crashed through her in waves, disbelief, anger, heartbreak. Her knees buckled and she sank onto the bed, tears spilling silently onto the sheets as she tried to steady her trembling hands. Betrayal cut deepest when delivered by those closest to the heart. The enormity of that truth pressed down on Sarah, suffocating and relentless. What hurt was not only the infidelity itself, but also the callousness, the lies spun so effortlessly, the stolen moments carved out of her own life, the furtive glances and double meanings she had witnessed but never understood. In the hours that followed, Sarah wandered in a daze, haunted by memories both beautiful and now irreparably tainted. She debated screaming, confronting, running. She longed to call someone, her mother, her sister, anyone who could offer comfort, but shame held her hostage. How had she not seen it coming? How had she trusted so blindly? But within the storm of her pain, a new emotion flickered to life, resolve. As anguish gave way to rage, Sarah began to think not just of her shattered trust, but of how deliberately their duplicity had been hidden from her. They had counted on her loyalty, her kindness, her need to see the best in others. They had underestimated her. No matter how strong the urge to collapse, Sarah refused to let this be the end of her story. That morning, as the sun stretched through the window, catching the glint of Daniel's forgotten wedding ring on the dresser, a single, searing thought crystallized in her mind. It was time to reclaim her power. Enduring in silence. The days following Sarah's devastating discovery blurred together into a haze of denial and quiet suffering. If an observer had glanced through the windows of her home, everything might have looked unchanged. She rose early, brewed her customary cup of coffee, chatted with Daniel over the morning news, and exchanged polite text messages with Emily. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, every word and gesture trembled with tension. Sarah became an actress in her own life, her performance measured and meticulous. She forced herself to smile at Daniel's casual remarks, pretending not to notice how he checked his phone under the table. Every touch, every glance, every routine interaction was filtered through a new, agonizing awareness. She tucked away evidence, screenshots of messages, notes about Daniel's late nights, and observations of Emily's comings and goings, like a careful archivist, determined to keep emotion from clouding her judgment. Some nights, Sarah stood at the bedroom window when Daniel was asleep, wrestling with the urge to scream or confront him. Yet each time, she reined herself in. She knew the risks of a hasty confrontation or a careless outburst. Instead, she resolved to gather the full scope of the truth before taking action. Privately, she began constructing her plan, brick by brick, making use of her sharp intellect and new, hard-earned wariness. Afternoons brought odd new rituals. Sarah found herself scrolling through bank statements and social media feeds with methodical precision. She noticed patterns in Emily's posts: subtle complaints about money, cryptic comments hinting at big changes, late-night check-ins at upscale restaurants. Sarah's intuition sharpened. These breadcrumbs hinted at vulnerabilities she might one day use. At times, doubt crept in, tempting her to confide in a trusted confidant. But humiliation won out. To her, the betrayal felt not only like a private wound, but also a judgment on her own character, a failure she could not bear to expose. So, she bottled up her emotions, determined to remain steady and invisible until she could seize the moment to act on her own terms. Sarah's vigilance extended into every corner of her life. She watched Daniel's reactions to her questions, testing his lies with new precision. She asked Emily about her job and her family, noting every hesitation and contradiction. Through it all, Sarah made sure not to arouse suspicion. She laughed at inside jokes when needed, chimed in on shared memories, and feigned sympathy over trivial complaints. On days when the pain became too much, Sarah channeled her anguish into action. She organized documents, began researching financial strategies, and made careful inquiries with legal advisors, always casual, always disguised as idle curiosity. The knowledge she accumulated became a shield, giving her a sense of control, however tenuous. There were hours of crushing loneliness, too. In private, Sarah grieved the loss of her old life, the joy of unguarded conversations, the comfort of trust, the simple belief that home was a safe place. But each time grief threatened to paralyze her, she reminded herself of her goal: to emerge not just unbroken, but stronger, smarter, and in command of her own fate. In this strange, silent battleground, Sarah discovered something new within herself, a resilience and clarity she never imagined she possessed. Enduring in silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. In her quiet suffering, the first seeds of her planned retribution began to grow. The mask of reconciliation. For the first time in weeks, Sarah woke with a strange sense of resolve shadowing her grief. The constant pressure in her chest, the tight band of pain that wrapped around each breath, began to loosen, replaced by something sharper and colder: determination. She stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror that morning, tilting her chin, practicing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Every muscle in her face had become a tool, every gesture a careful calculation. She would give them both exactly what they wanted: peace, forgiveness, and ignorance, while her true feelings stayed hermetically sealed beneath a flawless mask. The performance began over breakfast. Daniel sat at the table, eyes on his phone, clicking idly through emails. Sarah placed a hand gently on his shoulder, her touch light, undemanding, just as he preferred. "You seem tired lately," she said with practiced neutrality. Daniel looked up, startled by her kindness. "Long week, that's all," he replied, searching her gaze for any sign of accusation. But Sarah only nodded, offered a small smile, and poured him more coffee. She knew she had to erase every trace of suspicion. She needed him to relax, to believe that she was still the same trusting wife. That weekend, she made a point of inviting Emily over for lunch. It was their first time alone together since the day Sarah had uncovered the truth. As Emily entered the living room, clutching a basket of pastries and wearing her familiar, practiced grin, Sarah fought down a surge of disgust. She willed herself to remember how things once were: comfortable, easy, full of sisterly trust. That part of her had been excised, and what remained was antique politeness. "It's good to see you," Sarah said, hugging her friend just tightly enough to be convincing. Over mimosas and sandwiches, Sarah was sociable and attentive. She asked about Emily's new clients, the renovations to her apartment, even feigned laughter at recycled jokes. If Emily detected anything amiss, she gave no sign, though her eyes lingered too long on the family photos lining the hallway, the ones that showed all three of them smiling side by side. The air between them vibrated with unspoken tension. Yet Sarah, for all outward appearances, was the embodiment of warmth and understanding. As the meal wound down, Emily's facade began to falter. She looked tired, dark circles gathered under her carefully applied makeup, and her laughter rang a bit brittle. Sarah pounced on the opportunity, expertly guiding the conversation toward finances. "How's work been treating you lately?" she inquired, refilling their glasses. "You always look busy, but I know how uneven your field can be." Emily hesitated, a heartbeat too long. "Oh, you know how it is, feast or famine." She attempted breeziness, but her hands twisted the napkin in her lap. "It's just a phase. I have a couple of big commissions coming through next month." The words sounded rehearsed, too defensive. Sarah nodded sympathetically, letting comfortable silence stretch between them, as if signaling that there was no need for pretense. It wasn't long before Emily broke the silence. "Actually, I have been thinking about maybe doing something different. Investing, maybe. Something stable." The desperation in her tone was easy to miss, but not for Sarah. She saw the cracks spreading in her friend's armor, right where she needed them. Throughout the following weeks, Sarah continued to nurture this carefully crafted illusion of reconciliation in both her marriage and her friendship. With Daniel, she became attentive without being intrusive, showing understanding for his late nights and forgotten anniversaries while never raising the subject of his distance. She cooked his favorite meals, suggested evenings out when she knew he would make excuses, and even initiated conversations about the future they once dreamed of. All the while, she watched his responses, memorizing every nervous tick, every relieved sigh when she appeared genuinely unconcerned. Emily, on the other hand, received Sarah's listening ear and well-timed sympathy. Sarah engineered more lunches, more casual coffee dates, asking about work and life, expressing admiration for her friend's resilience. When she sensed Emily's guarded optimism, Sarah would gently probe for more, reminding her of past struggles and offering encouragement for a brighter financial future. "You're one of the smartest people I know, Em," she'd say. "Whatever you decide to do next, I'm sure you'll turn it around. Maybe it's time to start something new." Bit by bit, both Daniel and Emily began to let their guards down. Their secret was safe. Sarah made sure of it. Their relief made them careless, emboldening them to believe that the worst was behind them and that nothing had truly changed. Daniel became less vigilant with his phone. Emily spoke more openly about her worries, sometimes bemoaning debts and the unpredictability of her income. At moments, guilt seemed to flicker across their faces, but Sarah never acknowledged it, let alone condemned them. Behind the scenes, Sarah moved with icy precision. She kept meticulous notes and records, saving every shred of evidence and every detail of their conversations. She established discreet contact with a financial advisor, posing casual questions about investments and joint accounts under the guise of spousal interest. She began reading late into the night about legal protections, asset transfers, and strategies for securing her position, all while maintaining the bright, tranquil surface of peacemaking. There were moments of agony, of course. Alone in her room, Sarah would sometimes collapse into silent tears, mourning not only her marriage, but the friendship that had been poisoned beyond repair. She felt the strain of her double life pressing in from all sides, the isolation tightening around her like a vice. but she refused to let the pain distract her from the goal she had set. Endurance, she told herself over and over, is merely the first step toward justice. At home, she created new traditions. She organized family dinners, suggesting Daniel invite Emily along if he liked, anything to reinforce the illusion that all was well. She watched the two of them carefully, cataloging every sidelong glance, every private joke, every flicker of fear they tried to suppress. Her graciousness increased their guilt. Her kindness magnified their shame. Sarah weaponized her patience, understanding now that forgiveness need not be sincere to be effective. It could be strategic. Still, there were times when Daniel and Emily seemed to sense the tension lying just beneath the surface. They became almost needy in their gratitude, overcompensating with gifts and offers of help with meaningless chores. Sarah accepted everything with gratitude, but never wavered from her role as peacekeeper. Deep down, she knew that the longer she maintained the act, the more dependent they would become on her acceptance, and the harder they would fall when the truth erupted. By the end of the season, Sarah had constructed a fortress of trust and second chances around herself. To the world, she appeared magnanimous, even heroic, for her ability to salvage bonds others would have abandoned. But underneath the surface, her mind was a cold, silent engine. The hurt it fueled now repurposed for calculation and preparation. She was finally in control of the narrative, and her adversaries were completely unaware. The stage was set. The mask of reconciliation was firmly in place, yet behind its flawless smile, Sarah's eyes were open, clear, razor-sharp, and waiting. The financial trap. If there was one thing Sarah had learned through the torment of betrayal, it was the value of cold, methodical patience. She let the illusion of reconciliation sink deeper, drawing Daniel and Emily further under the spell of her apparent forgiveness. All the while, she watched, listened, and bided her time, waiting for the right moment to introduce her most cunning gambit yet. The opportunity revealed itself one evening, seemingly innocuous at first. Daniel returned from work earlier than usual, his expression wearier than she had ever seen. As he sat down at the kitchen table, Sarah noticed new lines of worry carving themselves into his forehead. She prepared his favorite tea, sat beside him, and asked how his day had been. He hesitated briefly, then sighed. "It's just the markets," he muttered. "There's been a lot of volatility. My manager's talking about layoffs. Makes you wonder if it's time to look for something safer, something we can control." Sarah feigned concern, reaching across to squeeze his hand. "I hate to see you stressed, Daniel. Maybe it wouldn't hurt for us to start thinking about a different kind of future. Not just relying on your job, maybe something we could build together." She kept her tone measured, gentle, encouraging, never forceful. That night, when Emily called to vent about her own mounting anxieties, slow payments from clients, a stalled freelance project, the feeling of the floor dropping beneath her finances, Sarah listened attentively. "You know," Sarah ventured, "I've been doing a lot of reading lately about investment opportunities. If we got in at the ground level, it could really change things, for all of us." "That sounds too good to be true," Emily replied, half joking, half hopeful. Sarah let the topic rest, but only for a few days. She began researching investment trends. Nothing illegal or outlandish, just enough jargon to sound legitimate. Startups, private equity, crowdfunding, a residential development project she had once read about. She collected glossy brochures, compiled spreadsheets, and scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor under the pretense of wanting to diversify her own assets. Every detail was carefully orchestrated. When she brought the idea up again, she did so casually, as if it had only just occurred to her. "I know you're both skeptical," she said over dinner, "but this is something real. I've talked with the advisor. The risk is low and the returns are projected to be incredible. We'd each have our own stake, but if we pool our resources, we could practically guarantee a payoff that would set us up for years." Daniel perked up. "What kind of investment?" "It's a managed partnership, some of those new real estate opportunities. The paperwork is all above board. The only trick is, we need to get in before the next round closes. They're only letting in people who come in through a personal reference, which thankfully I have." Emily tried to mask her eagerness. "How much would we have to put in?" "Not nearly as much as you'd think. I'm starting with my own savings, but if we all contribute, we'll each get a bigger share and a bigger return. I'll take care of the logistics. You guys just have to trust me." She showed them the investor brochures, complete with promising figures and testimonials. She talked about projected timeframes, expected appreciation of the asset, the low risk, and security. She let slip that the agreement would be under her name for simplification, since her reference was the main gateway. A few days later, Emily reached out in a nervous flurry. "Would you be upset if I pulled some money out of my emergency fund to get in on this? I know I shouldn't, but things are tight right now, and this—" "Well, what if it's our chance, right?" Sarah's voice was soft, reassuring. "I think it's smart, actually. Sometimes it's better to make a bold move than to wait and watch opportunities pass. You know I'd never push you into something I didn't believe in myself." Daniel, too, came around, though more cautiously. He requested to see the structuring documents, the statements from the financial advisor. Sarah made sure everything looked authentic, with all the signatures and seals in place. In reality, she had set up the paperwork through proper channels. Nothing was falsified. The real trick was that the assets and legal control would ultimately rest solely with her. In the weeks that followed, Sarah moved deftly. She opened a separate investment account in her own name, using the funds Daniel and Emily transferred. She documented every step, confirming with emails and digital signatures. She routed all communications through her, under the pretense of keeping everything streamlined. And so Daniel wouldn't tip off his bank about large transfers at once. During private moments, she feigned excitement with Emily, discussing what they'd do with their shares once the project matured. "Maybe you can finally pay off those lingering debts," Sarah said, her eyes bright, "or invest in your art studio the way you always dreamed." Emily began planning aloud, swept up in Sarah's enthusiasm. Daniel was more subdued, but each time Sarah offered a progress update, he seemed a little more trusting, a little more at ease. The prospect of financial empowerment, combined with Sarah's apparent good graces, lulled him into letting down his guard. The more they invested, the more they confided in Sarah, sharing worries about work, about the future, about wanting something of their own to hold on to. Sarah listened, encouraged, and guided, all the while tightening her grip around the project. No detail was overlooked. She kept spreadsheets, checklists, and a folder filled with scanned contracts. She ensured the point of legal ownership, every account, document, and asset traced back to her. Occasionally, Daniel or Emily raised a question. Could the project really be this secure? Were there hidden downsides? Sarah always acknowledged their doubts patiently, offering reassurances and light-hearted jokes. "What's the worst that could happen?" she'd ask. "We're in this together. I promise, nothing happens without all of us knowing." It was only in her own room at night, her phone screen glowing amid the darkness, that she allowed her face to fall slack with exhaustion. The careful upkeep of so many roles was almost as draining as the betrayal itself. But Sarah never allowed herself to lose focus. The trap was set, and both their livelihoods were now tangled in its net. Soon, she knew, they would be so deeply invested, Financially and emotionally, that retreat would no longer be possible. All that remained was to watch them walk, step by fateful step, ever closer to the edge she had so artfully prepared. And so Sarah waited, smile in place, while Daniel and Emily toasted to the brighter times ahead, oblivious to the fact that the keys to their futures were already out of their hands. The gamble begins. The stage was meticulously set. If anyone had looked in from the outside, they would have seen a picture-perfect collaboration. A husband, wife, and her best friend embarking on an exciting joint investment. Yet beneath the surface, Sarah watched every detail with the steely vigilance of a chess master, orchestrating the final moves of a long, bitter match. The first few weeks following the official launch of their financial partnership buzzed with the hopeful energy of new beginnings. Sarah handled every detail, setting up dedicated online accounts, scheduling video calls with their advisor, and providing frequent emailed updates laced with projected gains and market optimism. Daniel, cautiously optimistic, would join these meetings after work, absorbing charts and forecasts with the same careful skepticism he once reserved for house projects and family vacations. Emily, on the other hand, became almost giddy when discussing timelines and possibilities, her words tumbling out in a rush of hope. It wasn't just the numbers that seemed promising. It was the sensation of movement, of control. For Daniel, it was a rare opportunity to invest in his own future, steering his destiny rather than surrendering it to layoffs and shifting management priorities. For Emily, mired in the unpredictability of freelance gigs, the venture shimmered as her best hope to finally escape the hamster wheel of instability. Sarah played her role to perfection. She was encouraging when Daniel hesitated, gently nudging but never pressuring. She was attentive to Emily's fluctuating moods, validating her friend's financial worries, and highlighting how this project could be her lifeline. In public and private, she remained the calm, competent anchor around whom both of their anxieties seemed to settle. Every week, Sarah circulated progress reports, carefully crafted spreadsheets, bullet-pointed recaps of milestones reached, and subtle reminders that all legal and financial control converged under her stewardship for the sake of efficiency and compliance. She arranged a celebratory dinner for the three of them after the transfer of funds was finalized, raising her glass in a cheerful toast. To our future, a new chapter for all of us. Daniel smiled, visibly more relaxed than he had been in months, while Emily's eyes filled with relief and something like gratitude. Excitement soon blurred with overconfidence. Daniel started talking about what they might do with the profits. A vacation, replacing an ancient car, maybe even early retirement if things went well. Emily dared to dream of a new art studio and a financial cushion that would finally silence her creditors. Chasing these visions, both found themselves confiding more and more in Sarah, seeking her validation whenever a new anxiety surfaced. Privately, Sarah tightened her grip on every aspect of the endeavor. She kept every password and document locked away, updated her private logs after every communication, and even rehearsed contingency plans for any question Daniel or Emily might raise. She encouraged her co-investors to consult her before making any move. Just send me your questions, and I'll make sure the advisor gets back to us. I know this stuff can be overwhelming. Emily's trust was almost absolute. Some afternoons, Sarah would find voicemails from her friend filled with nervy excitement or frantic questions about timelines, her voice lighter when she heard reassurances about expected returns. They had coffee in bustling cafes, going over printouts together, Emily's anxiety melting into an expectant glow each time Sarah pointed out another milestone met or an anticipated bonus payment. Daniel's participation was tinged with a more measured pride. He quietly arranged his own finances, consolidating investments to free up his commitment, and, more importantly, began to equate the financial endeavor with repairing his relationship with Sarah. On evenings when they sat together reviewing numbers or celebrating small wins, he'd reach for her hand across the table, the tension that had haunted their marriage for months momentarily receding. Sarah responded with an affectionate, almost apologetic warmth, deepening his dependency on her guidance. Sarah's hold over the project was both emotional and administrative. She choreographed every family dinner, every shared laugh, every soft moment of encouragement, aware of how deftly she was guiding Daniel and Emily further along a road from which neither could easily turn back. If either of them felt a passing flicker of doubt, say when newer documents reaffirmed all ownership structures under Sarah's name, or when the advisor communicated only through Sarah's channels, they swallowed it, soothed by her steady confidence and the persistent trail of positive news. The early dividends were small but strategic. Sarah dispersed marginal gains, just enough to reinforce belief, but not enough to trigger suspicion or impatience. She shared photo updates of the development lot, quarterly investment summaries, copies of official filings, and congratulatory emails. The sense of shared purpose and budding prosperity formed a cocoon, insulating any residual unease. By now, Daniel and Emily were championing the investment to others as well, glowing in the reflected light of its supposed success. Emily began paying off overdue bills with winnings from their first withdrawal, and Daniel allowed himself daydreams of future promotions or a new business venture, buoyed by their rising nest egg. All the while, Sarah kept the real ledger, one in which every cent flowed ultimately and inescapably through her. Amidst this whirlwind, Sarah maintained a balancing act that required constant vigilance. Sometimes she spent long, sleepless nights triple-checking her records, mentally mapping every possible break in her strategy. She rehearsed responses to likely questions and alternate scenarios, training herself in the art of redirection and reassurance. She tracked Daniel and Emily's behavioral cues, subtle changes in tone or hesitation, always keenly alert for any telltale sign of suspicion. Yet none came. Their shared eagerness and trust had become armor. Ironically, the very thing that would enthrall them to her plan. Despite her calculating purpose, Sarah felt the emotional weight of her charade press heavily upon her, especially in moments of solitude. Standing alone on the balcony late at night, she sometimes questioned who she was becoming. What had been lost in this act of retribution, and how much of her old, trusting self would remain when it was all over. But clarity always returned. This was justice, hard lessons for those who had gambled with her heart. As this strange new chapter unfolded, Sarah found herself not only an executor of revenge, but an architect of her own resurgence. For the first time in years, she felt fully in command, not simply of her finances, but of her own direction. Each small victory, each successfully orchestrated step, rebuilt fragments of confidence long eroded by betrayal. The gamble had begun in earnest, and its stakes rose with every passing week. Daniel and Emily, blinded by hope and lulled by Sarah's gentle authority, had invested not just their savings, but their sense of security, their fragile dreams, their faith in a future built on collaboration. But only Sarah could see the whole board. She alone managed the real risks, the kinds that would matter when the game came, inevitably, to its conclusion. Inside, shadows shifted as Sarah quietly moved her pieces, one by one. Now, more than ever, every day, every action, and every promise carried the weight and momentum of fate itself. The endgame approached, but for Daniel and Emily, the thrill of the gamble had only just begun. The truth exposed. For weeks, the carefully woven structure of Sarah's financial trap had held fast, binding Daniel and Emily tighter with every passing day. The tension in the triangle vibrated just beneath the outwardly smooth surface of their lives, a subtle current only Sarah could sense and exploit. Her rivals, lulled by comfort and blinded by guilt, began to make plans for brighter futures. They spoke of vacations, new projects, and the security their joint investment would soon provide, utterly unaware that every rung they climbed took them closer to the edge of a steep, invisible precipice. Then, as autumn crept quietly across the city, the first shadow of disaster found its way inside. The news came not with a bang, but as a tremor, an ambiguous, cautious email from the investment firm's account manager. Due to unforeseen regulatory changes, the ambitious real estate project at the center of their scheme was being placed under review. Disbursements were frozen. Access to capital was restricted. At first, Daniel brushed it off with an air of optimism, certain that such setbacks were common in ambitious ventures. Emily, more jittery, texted Sarah in the middle of the night, her messages frantic, full of questions Sarah calmly brushed aside. Within days, uncertainty thickened into panic. Online forums buzzed with rumors of the firm's pending insolvency. Employees stopped answering phone calls. Daniel grew terse and withdrawn, scrolling obsessively through finance news on his phone each night and snapping at trivial things. Emily's anxiety became all-consuming. She stopped sleeping, started biting her nails to the quick, and called Sarah sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, her desperation obvious and seeping through every word. Sarah played her part with icy detachment, mastering the language of commiseration. When Daniel raged at the kitchen table about lost savings and lack of information, Sarah nodded in all the right places, occasionally brushing his hand in a show of support. She reminded him of the advisor's reassurances, the official documents, the testimonials they'd all seen. With Emily, her tone was gentle, even soothing, as she suggested, "Let's wait. These things usually work out after a bit of legal back and forth. There's little we can do until we get an official update." But beneath her serene exterior, her mind was whirring. The moment of exposure was fast, approaching, and Sarah ensured that all her records, every confidential email, every contract, every digital transfer, were in order and accessible only by her. She double-checked legal access to the accounts, ensuring that all real property and liquid assets rested solely under her name, per the structure she'd skillfully engineered from the beginning. She rehearsed what she might need to say, running through plausible denials, ready to reveal every sordid detail if cornered. At last, the inevitable reckoning arrived. A single official email from the firm landed in their shared inboxes, marked urgent. Funds were, they said, unrecoverable. The project was a loss. The legal jargon was stark and unyielding. The market had shifted abruptly, and the company's precautions hadn't sufficed. Everything was gone. Daniel received the news at work. By the time he returned home, ashen, speechless, Sarah had already set the stage. Emily arrived 10 minutes later, wild-eyed and trembling, unable to formulate a sentence before dissolving into tears on the couch. The apartment felt suffocating, packed with a decade's worth of lost trust and barely healed wounds now shattered beyond repair. Sarah stood at the threshold of the living room, her back straight, her face composed. She let the silence stretch just long enough to press on Daniel and Emily like a physical weight. Then, almost gently, she spoke. "I suppose we all knew, somewhere deep down, that this day might come." Daniel's jaw clenched. "This happened because we trusted the wrong people." Sarah's expression didn't flicker. "That's one way to see it. Another is that you trusted the wrong person with the wrong secrets." Emily looked up, tears streaking her makeup. "What are you saying, Sarah?" Sarah moved to the center of the room, standing over the 2 people who had once meant everything to her. With a precision that was almost surgical, She began to lay out the details, first about the investment, then, piece by piece, about what she'd known for months. The affair, the lies, the calculated betrayals. She didn't raise her voice. There was no need. Each fact landed with the gentle gravity of a stone being dropped into a calm lake. No violence, just silent and devastating ripples. She described how she'd traced Emily's late-night movements on social media, how Daniel's stories were always too carefully synchronized with Emily's vague excuses, and how she'd connected the dots long before either of them suspected. She revealed the emails, the texts, the receipts, the conversations she'd overheard but never confronted. Their faces shifted from fear to horror, then to shame. But why? Daniel finally managed, barely above a whisper. Why would you? Sarah's eyes glinted, hard as polished steel. Because you thought I was blind. Because you both thought I'd always forgive, that I'd always come last after your secret happiness. Her voice softened, but the edge remained. So I decided, for once, to put myself first. Emily shook her head, her hands shaking. You planned this? All of it? I gave you both chances. So many. You kept making your choices, and I simply made mine. Daniel's shoulders sagged, the energy draining from his frame. Everything's gone. All of it? Not for me, Sarah replied, her voice level. I protected myself. I protected what little dignity you left me after your betrayals. The rest, your savings, your dreams, are the real price of what you did. In that moment, the room seemed frozen, time stretching impossibly thin as each of them struggled with the enormity of what had been said and done. Sarah was no longer the wounded spouse or the friend deceived. She was the architect of her own deliverance, and her adversaries could do nothing but reckon with what remained. As Daniel stared blankly at the floor and Emily wept quietly beside him, Sarah turned to leave the room, her footsteps steady, her silhouette illuminated briefly by the late autumn light filtering through the windows. She had exposed the truth in its entirety, every secret, every motive, every injury and premeditated step. Whatever followed, she alone would decide what came next. And as the reality of their new, broken existence began to settle around Daniel and Emily, Sarah felt, just for an instant, a lightness in her chest. The truth, long held in silence, had finally set her free. The bitter aftermath. The apartment's silence was the kind that seemed to swallow sound whole, thick, and suffocating in the wake of Sarah's revelations. Daniel remained rooted in his chair for what felt like hours, his gaze lost in a blur on the living room carpet. Emily sat curled on one end of the sofa, limbs pulled tight around herself, eyes red and lips trembling, unable to muster words strong enough to bridge the chasm between them. The damaging truth hung over them, too immense and too final to ignore. This was not the future they had gambled for. Each had imagined something different at the outset, a fresh start, a secret happiness, an escape from the old miseries that had once united them in laughter and trust. Now, exposed and penniless, both Daniel and Emily found themselves stranded at the edge of ruin, bound together not by hope, but by mutual despair. In the days that followed, Daniel oscillated between rage and anguish. He tore through old drawers and thumbed through binders and bills, desperate for some trace of reassurance, a loophole that might restore what had been lost. Each failed search deepened his sense of humiliation. At work, his office badge felt heavier around his neck. Co-workers' polite questions about his weekend stung as small, unintentional wounds. He grew hollow-eyed, snapping at small annoyances, fidgeting through meetings, unable to bear the reminder that his carefully built world had always rested on a fragile illusion. Nights were the worst. Alone in what once was a shared bed, Daniel was haunted by the echo of Sarah's calm voice, disclosing the affairs and the deception, by the memory of Emily's sobs and the look of silent accusation in her eyes. His anger, when it came, was as much for himself as for anyone else. Emily's spiral was quieter, but no less desperate. She stopped answering calls from friends and family, too ashamed to admit that she had lost not only her greatest ally, but also her sense of direction. Her freelance projects dried up as she missed deadlines and failed to return client messages. Her apartment grew messier by the day. Coffee mugs, unopened mail, unfinished sketches piled up in long, lonely hours, when all she could do was replay Sarah's exposure of every secret she'd shared. What hurt most wasn't simply the financial blow or the shame of being caught. It was the simple, aching absence of Sarah's friendship, the loss of the one person who had always championed her before all the lies. Daniel and Emily crossed paths occasionally, awkward phone calls necessitated by residual legal paperwork, half-hearted attempts to debrief and assign blame, each conversation brittle and terse. Once, Daniel accused Emily of orchestrating the affair as a way to leverage Sarah for money. Emily, in turn, lashed out with accusations that he'd always been selfish, that he'd only ever cared about saving his own reputation. Their conversations, instead of bringing closure, only deepened their misery, confirming that their alliance, such as it was, had been built on selfishness, not solidarity. Meanwhile, Sarah found herself embracing a severe, liberating solitude. Far from the chaos she'd engineered, her days took on a different texture. Quiet, deliberate, and, at last, her own. She ignored Daniel's half-hearted attempts at reconciliation. A single text message here, a voicemail filled with apologies there. She deleted them unread. When her attorney contacted her about dissolving any residual joint assets, she answered efficiently and without sentiment. Sarah had grown fluent in boundaries, fluent in saying no, where she once bent herself to compromise. Financially, Sarah was secure, having protected her share before setting the plan in motion. But the victory tasted both sweet and ash-like. She spent hours at her window, watching the city lights flicker below, measuring freedom against the cost of her vengeance. She felt stronger, undisputedly, but not invulnerable. Sometimes, in the blue shadows before dawn, grief leaked through the cracks, grief for the life that might have been, for the trust broken so thoroughly it could never be reclaimed. Yet if pain lingered, so too did a quiet pride. Sarah had done what she needed to reclaim her dignity, to assert herself in a drama where she'd once been cast as the trusting victim. For Daniel and Emily, however, the fall was ongoing. Daniel lost his job after a string of bad decisions and mounting absenteeism. His reputation, long burnished by the appearance of stability, crumbled as he struggled to explain his financial troubles without revealing the full, sordid story. Friends became distant. Family offered only terse, conditional sympathy. Emily eventually returned to her art, but found her work darker, lonelier. Her old vibrancy replaced by muted tones, her circle of confidants whittled down to one or two forgiving acquaintances who knew only fragments of her shame. Their former home, once a stage for laughter and birthdays, became another asset to be divided. Pictures came down, boxes were packed, and the echoes of happy times faded beneath the shuffle of moving trucks and impersonal strangers touring the now empty rooms. They barely spoke at the final meeting with the lawyers, their signatures stiff and unsteady, their eyes downcast. The shared understanding passed between them wordlessly. There would be no restoring what they'd broken. The world moved on around them, indifferent to their failures. For Daniel and Emily, every day was colored by regret and the heavy memory of the woman they'd underestimated so deeply. They became warning tales among their acquaintances, cautionary examples of selfish love, of betrayal's price, of how the pursuit of fleeting happiness can wreck the very foundation of a life. Sarah, meanwhile, refused to be haunted. She chose to step forward, if not entirely unscarred, then at least self-governed. She rebuilt, carving a new identity out of ashes, her sense of self no longer contingent on anyone's affection or approval. From the rubble, she rose, not forgiving, perhaps, but free. Thus, the bitter aftermath settled into the immutable past. The lesson was eternal. Trust, once shattered, could never be restored by force of will or half-hearted apology. Only the recognition of one's own worth and the courage to defend it could offer any path to redemption. Sarah's rebirth. The first winter after the storm of betrayal and reckoning swept through her life arrived quietly, unheralded, and unexpectedly gentle. Sarah found the chill in the air invigorating, a welcome change from the oppressive atmosphere that had long haunted her home. Instead of huddling under the weight of old grief, she rolled up her sleeves and set about reclaiming her place in the world, determined to build something for herself on the other side of survival. At first, the process felt halting and unnatural, like relearning how to walk. The mornings were the most difficult, the silence of her new apartment, smaller, lighter, and uniquely hers, echoing with old memories. But Sarah made rituals out of this solitude, lighting a candle as the sun rose, brewing fresh coffee, and scribbling long, honest entries in a journal she never would have dared keep before. She found comfort in small, intentional acts, watering plants in her sunny kitchen, rearranging thrifted furniture in ways that pleased only her, choosing bold curtains and bright bed linens that would have seemed out of place in her former shared life. She allowed herself to grieve in healthy ways. Some afternoons were spent curled up with her journals and a mug of tea, letting tears come and go as they pleased. Unlike before, she was not hiding from anguish or pretending it could be fixed by denial. She was honoring it, making space for pain as a teacher and not an adversary. Nights, once menacing in their loneliness, became an invitation for rediscovery. She read books that inspired her and picked up the paintbrushes she had abandoned back in college, surprising herself with vibrant, urgent canvases crowded with color. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah felt something shift deep inside her. The urge for movement, physical, emotional, and professional, took hold, and she began to say yes to new experiences with a bravery born from her trials. On weekends, she joined a group hike, surprising herself with endurance on unfamiliar trails. Sometimes she went to art classes, sometimes to lively open mic nights at a cozy neighborhood cafe, delighting in the unfiltered company of strangers. She rediscovered an appetite for the world that she hadn't realized she'd lost. Her professional life, which had atrophied under the shadow of Daniel's ambitions, suddenly flourished. She updated her resume, signed up for workshops in digital marketing, and took on bold freelance projects. No longer cowed by the prospect of judgment or failure, she networked deliberately, approaching every conversation with curiosity and an easy confidence that surprised old colleagues. Her efforts soon paid off. Referrals led to steady new clients, and within months, she'd budgeted enough to consider launching the boutique creative consultancy she'd once only dreamed about. Yet power, she discovered, wasn't merely about independence or financial comfort. It was about naming her own boundaries for the first time. She reconnected with old friends she'd lost touch with during her marriage, reconnecting not as someone's wife or confidant, but as herself. She was honest about the year behind her, but she didn't dwell in bitterness. Instead, she listened to others' stories, realizing how universal her pain and her hope really were. Therapy, once something Sarah would have considered a sign of weakness, became a cornerstone of her growth. With gentle persistence, her therapist helped her untangle the knots of shame and insecurity Daniel and Emily's betrayal had left behind. Through patient work, Sarah learned to forgive herself for trusting, for loving deeply, and for her own missteps. Each session left her feeling a little lighter, a little more herself. She grew more compassionate, not just with herself, but with others as well. Volunteering at the local women's shelter became a weekly joy, the camaraderie and laughter in those rooms reminding her that resilience is contagious. She found purpose in listening, in sharing advice, in reminding other women, many in similar circumstances, that life after heartbreak was not only possible, but could be glowingly abundant. Perhaps most transformative of all was the way Sarah learned to trust her instincts. She no longer ignored subtle discomfort or gaslit herself into accepting less than she deserved. Whether choosing clients, new friends, or simply how she wanted to spend a precious Saturday, she put her needs at the center for the first time in her adult life. Some nights, in quiet moments after a long day, she reflected on the strange gift of loss. The pain, so shattering at first, had eventually carved out space for joy she'd never encountered before. Her world had shrunk, but only in the best ways. It was peaceful, honest, and entirely her own. There were times she remembered Daniel and Emily, but the ache no longer overwhelmed her. Their choices no longer defined her story. Instead, they were stepping stones across a river, nothing more. As her birthday approached that year, Sarah decided to host a modest celebration in her apartment. The guest list included only those who had been truly present through her struggles. The friends who showed up with soup on tear-soaked nights, her therapist, and a few new companions from her creative circles. The party was low-key and full of laughter, homemade pizza, candles flickering on mismatched plates, and music from a playlist crowdsourced via group chat. At midnight, a spontaneous toast circled the room, and as the kind wishes ended, Sarah felt a surge of gratitude so fierce it brought tears to her eyes. She raised her glass, her voice steady. To new beginnings, to knowing our worth, and to never doubting ourselves again. Looking around at the smiling faces, Sarah realized she was living proof of how profoundly a heart could heal, given patience, courage, and self-respect. Her story was no longer a narrative of loss. It was a declaration of sovereignty. She had survived betrayal, yes, but more importantly, she had stepped into the blazing center of her own life. And as dawn spread gold over her city, Sarah stood on her balcony, wind tugging at her hair, the air alive with promise. Her past would always be part of her, but it was no longer her jailer. She breathed deeply. The future, limitless and bright, was finally hers to claim. The price of betrayal. In the quiet that followed Sarah's transformation, the consequences of betrayal rippled outward, affecting not only those at the center of the storm, but all who lingered at its edges. The truth had detonated in silence. There had been no yelling, no shattered plates, only confessions and the even heavier weight of realization. Yet the fallout endured, insistent, reshaping lives in ways that none could have foreseen. Daniel's life, once so meticulously planned, had become a slow unraveling. After the loss of his savings and the exposure of his duplicity, he found himself increasingly isolated. The people who had once admired him for his professional success had started to drift away, discomforted by his changed demeanor. His colleagues noticed his distractedness and lack of focus. Mistakes crept into his work, and his dependable reputation faded. Eventually, his contract was terminated quietly, the company citing poor performance and changes in staffing needs. No one in the office mentioned the rumors, but Daniel knew they existed. His friendships, too, withered. Invitations slowed to a trickle, then vanished. Even family calls felt awkward, laced with pity he couldn't stand. He moved out of the apartment they'd once shared, finding a small space on the far side of town. The rooms were sparsely furnished. At night, the loneliness pressed in. The absence of partnership, the loss of routine, the echo of a life that had belonged to someone else. He cycled through regret and resentment, sometimes blaming Sarah for her cunning, more often haunted by self-disgust for failing to see her pain, for taking both her loyalty and Emily's friendship for granted. The financial loss stung, yes, but far worse was the realization that pride and carelessness had cost him far more than money. Emily's descent was even more isolated. Her freelance career, already precarious, faltered under the stress of scandal and anxiety. Clients disappeared gradually as deadlines slipped. She sold off canvases and borrowed from long-estranged relatives to pay her bills. The studio that had once been her sanctuary collected dust while she grappled with creative paralysis. Outwardly, she maintained composure, posting cheerful updates and photos of old work, but friends sensed her withdrawal. The greatest injury, Emily realized, was internal. She had broken her own values for a fleeting thrill, only to realize too late how hollow it all was. She missed Sarah nearly every day, a dull longing she tried to ignore by numbing herself with routine. Attempts at reconciliation, texts drafted, never sent, were always abandoned, the shame too strong to risk a cold response. Sometimes, when sleep eluded her, she replayed the joyous days of their friendship. Then the careless escalation of risk, wondering if she'd been sabotaging herself all along. Both Daniel and Emily became pariahs of a sort. Where once they had found solace in each other, perhaps out of shared guilt, perhaps out of the temporary validation their affair provided, they now found only accusation. Meetings to finalize their failed joint investments were brief and bitter. Neither could entirely forgive the other. Both shielded themselves with fragile defenses, blaming desperation, loneliness, or simple mistakes. In truth, they each saw their own flaws reflected in the other's disappointment. Meanwhile, Sarah's victory was both real and costly. She had safeguarded her finances, her dignity, and most importantly, her self-respect. Yet even her triumph did not feel uncomplicatedly sweet. She sometimes woke in the early morning hours with a heaviness in her chest, remembering not the betrayals, but the laughter and warmth she'd once shared with Daniel and Emily. The knowledge that she had orchestrated their downfall, however just, brought its own burden. A reminder that in the theater of justice, there are no winners, only survivors. Her inner circle narrowed, but it grew deeper, richer. With time, Sarah learned to trust again, but with discernment born from pain. She built relationships rooted in honesty and empathy. When new acquaintances learned of her past, she spoke with candor, but without self-pity. "You can't always see betrayal coming," she would sometimes say, "but you can choose how it shapes what comes after." Her story became a quiet warning, a parable passed quietly among her friends and at support groups, an example of the high cost of placing trust carelessly. If Sarah sometimes wondered whether she could have prevented it all, if more vigilance, more communication, or less self-sacrifice could have changed the outcome, she always circled back to the same truth. Betrayal says more about the betrayer than the betrayed. Forgiveness, she knew, was not owed. Boundaries, she learned, were essential. In her neighborhood, others talked about the scandal for a while. Whispered speculation at book clubs, sympathetic glances at the grocery store. But time, as always, moved forward. Daniel and Emily eventually became footnotes, reminders to others of the dangers of secrecy and disloyalty. Sarah's story, in contrast, steadily evolved from one of being wronged to one of earned autonomy and self-discovery. One spring night, Sarah attended a dinner party filled with laughter and warmth. She listened as others shared setbacks, turning over in her mind the fits and starts of her recent path. When asked for advice, she smiled and offered what had become her mantra. You can collect the pieces, even the sharp ones. Sometimes, you find that what's broken wasn't yours to fix. Daniel, looking back years later, would realize that his greatest error had never been the affair itself, but the erosion of empathy, the letting go of gratitude for what he already had. For Emily, the price was subtler, the loss of her creative spark, the persistent ache of having hurt the person she'd once called sister. An ache exacerbated by never finding the courage to apologize in person. Betrayal's price, in the end, was not measured in asset statements, apartment leases, or even the loneliness of new addresses. It was measured in lost futures, in the aching gaps left in ordinary days, in the knowledge that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. It was the self-doubt that haunted the nights, the wary kindnesses in new relationships, the empty place at the table during long-awaited celebrations. But if the price was high, the lessons ran deeper still. Trust could be rebuilt, but only with work and humility. Independence was both shield and gift. Most vitally of all, the wounds of betrayal, if met with honesty and courage, could eventually give way to new forms of strength. Sarah stepped forward, her scars no longer marks of shame, but badges of survival. Daniel and Emily, chastened, walked their separate paths, their names joined only in the memory of a chapter best left closed. And as Sarah welcomed the dawn of her new life, she understood that the lasting price of betrayal was its power to change what and who she would ever trust again.